Hello, this is Beverly from scrapandthread.blogspot.com. Today I'm going to show you how to turn a 9-patch block into a structured improv block. You're going to take a 9-patch and slice it across from one end to the other, and then you're going to insert a strip of fabric. It doesn't matter where you slice your 9-patch. You can do it across the center, but you want to go side to side. And then you're going to sew in a strip of fabric, and it can be any width of fabric you want. The smallest I use is 3/4 of an inch typically because then I get a quarter of an inch of fabric showing. Now, what will happen when you're sewing the next piece together is that you may notice that the edges no longer line up, and that's okay. I'm probably going to cut off the outside edges anyway, and so that part doesn't matter to me. What I'm really looking at is what the inside part's going to look like with those inset strips. I'm auditioning different widths and colors, and that works out really well before I cut. When I figured out where I want to make my next cut, I slice it again. Okay, to go through that initial insert that I had already done. And I'm going to sew it again together, and I'll sew it on one side and press it open, and then I will sew the other side to it. Now this is where I care lining it up on the inside part. If I try to line it up on the outside, that middle line looks kind of funny to me, and so I prefer to line it up so that they are, so that it looks like a continuous line on the inside part. You can also use the inset strips on just the individual blocks, or excuse me, squares of fabric prior to sewing it into the 9-patch. So for instance, these are 5-inch squares. That's what I was making my 9 patches out of. And I'm going to slice them, and I don't stack them because I do want them to be a little bit different with each one. And if they're stacked, then they all look exactly the same. You can turn them around, and that would kind of alleviate some of that, but this way I find it looks a little bit better. And you can see I'm mixing black and white strips because of the color of the fabric here, and I think that that works out really well. And then you do the exact same process where you sew on one side, insert the strip, and then sew the other side to it. Now, because this is smaller, I do try to match the outside edges, and I pin, and so typically they match pretty well, and well enough so that it can kind of get fudged into the seam allowance when I'm sewing them into the 9-patch. I don't trim off the outside edges until I am ready to go with the little flaps there. But what I am trimming off is that I noticed that I must have sewn that strip in a little wonky at the end, and so I ended up with extra kind of a wave there, and I don't want that to be a part of my block, so I did trim it on the outside. But I do leave the little inset, little flappy things on the outside until I'm ready to sew the 5-inch squares together. Now, another way you can do this is instead of doing individual squares and insetting or doing the entire 9-patch, you can take a row of 3 and just inset the fabric that way. And the reason why you might want to do this is that maybe it's easier for you to handle a smaller block at your sewing machine, but mainly it's because if you do it where you're going more vertically on those 3 squares sewn together, then you can get a nice effect with having it kind of like a hidden inset in the middle. Now, I do try to do a little bit of auditioning before I cut up the other parts of my blocks once I get going. I don't usually do much auditioning in the beginning, but I do a little bit later on, just kind of to see where I'm at and what I like. Mainly, I'm looking for the placement of the strips as far as how the flow is and also the width of the strip. At this point, I've decided mainly on the black for that one block. This one is kind of a purplish color. It doesn't show up that way on here, but I'm kind of doing the same thing. And I did use the solid purplish color for my strips also. I looked at black and white, and I didn't really like how that looked. I liked it just seemed more pleasing to me to use the same colors as some of what was going to go into that block. Now, one of the things I did notice is that this block was getting a little wonky because of all of the insets that I had done. So I found that one seam line was pretty straight, so I used that as my guide for measuring across to kind of even out and straighten that one edge so I have a straighter edge to sew to. And that sort of helps. And once again, you can see how this block is a lot more narrow at the top than it is at the bottom. And so for me, I'm trying to kind of figure out what are some measurements that I can use so that I can kind of square that up. I don't need it to be perfect, but I want it to be square-ish. And maybe later I will make it even smaller depending on what I'm going to use this block for. It turns out that block was almost a half of an inch difference at the top than it was at the bottom, and that is fairly significant. And when you're trying to sew blocks together, that may be an issue. Now, if you're doing an entirely improvisational type quilt, it may not be an issue for you at all, but it sort of depends on what you're looking for. And you can see that middle kind of dark green block is inset a lot more than the other ones were, and so that was my measurement that I used. You need to take the most narrow part if you're trying to make a square, whatever the narrowest is, and that would be your measurement. And if you're making it a square, then it needs to be whatever the narrowest is going both directions. So if it happens to be 13 inches when you're done using 5-inch squares to begin with, then it needs to be 13 inches square. Now here you can see this one is, it's kind of getting a little pollywampus there, and that's okay. I'm going to continue to add my strips before I do any more cutting on the outside because it doesn't matter to me right now what is happening with the outside. I just care more about what's happening on the inside. Now once again, this is a block that I had done the insets on the individual 5-inch squares, and then I also added some big strips in the middle. And this is the one that I started with where I only had the large strips going across from side to side or up and down. And you can add as many as you want or as few as you want. I will tell you that the more you add, the smaller your block will end up being, because you may have a lot more trimming to do. But also, there's sometimes some shifting of the fabric if it's not cut on the straight of grain or on the lengthwise grain. You may end up having some kind of wobbly or wavy lines in there. So when you do decide what you're going to do, you may need to try to find something to measure that'll make it even. And sometimes in the case of this one, I had to go with an outside measurement because the inside was so skewed that it wouldn't work. Now, that's not to say that that's a problem if you like that and you want it to have that kind of look to it. That's totally fine. I am probably going to put this into a quilt, so I do want them to be somewhat squared. And I have found in the past that if some of my blocks are a lot smaller than some of the others, just because I don't want to trim off all of that hard work, I will maybe add a sashing strip to the outside of the block, maybe even on two sides, if that helps it so that it fits into my quilt better and I get to use the full size of the other blocks. If you're using scraps, for instance, and maybe some of them are cut on the bias, you can end up with some interesting kind of curves to what you're doing, and that can certainly change the outside of your blocks. Now, in this particular one, you can see I have kind of a straight line on one side, or excuse me, one seam, but I have a lot of kind of weird things going on the outside parts. So once again, I try to measure, what is my smallest part and then cut from there. And this is an example of this block being smaller than another one that is from that same fabric line. And so I would add a piece of sashing so that it would work because I don't want to cut down that other fabric. I love the fabric, so I don't want to miss out on seeing any of it. I hope you consider making your own structured improv 9-patch quilt or maybe just the block to see if you like the technique. There are more photographs and tips on my blog. Please stop by at scrapandthread.blogspot.com. Thanks so much for spending time with me today. I sure do appreciate it. Take care. Bye-bye.